my name is Mel. This is Create and Company, and you, my bold, brave, beautiful creatives, are part of the community where we create more than procrastinate. Okay, so check it out. We're still going through the Create Act, A Way of Being by Rick Rubin. We're now on page 163, mini chapter Crafting. So we had been in the 2 stages of seed finding and experimentation, and now we get to crafting. And he says that once the seed's code has been cracked and its true form deciphered, now the process shifts, and now we're not in that unbounded or open landscape of just discovering. Now we have a clear sense of direction. And now it's the time of building, the labor of building. Before we were asking, what does the work have to say to us? And now he says we apply our filter. We start brick laying. He says this can be the phase where a lot of us struggle to keep on track because it's not as potentially exciting as those first phases, but he says to still continue to follow the hints of excitement. I liked this part. He said, we may be tempted to turn back and chase the thrill of feeling the light bulb flicker above our heads. But the first 2 phases have little purpose or meaning on their own. Art may only exist, and the artist may only evolve by completing the work. By completing the work. As lovely as it is to be telling everyone about the idea, completing the work is even juicier. And I know a lot of us stay in the romance, per se, of the pre-phases, and he ends up telling us why that happens. He says a lot of times we're so scared that our idea won't be as we want it to be, that we delay because we don't think we can get to that technical skill, or we can bring it to being the way we thought it should be. And he encourages to let go of that because sometimes it can come through in a different way that's even better. And we don't have to hold on so tightly on what I think ends up being perfectionism and impossibly high standards. He has other tips about the crafting phase. He says that in a single work session, you can jump between different projects because that can help you in terms of not putting as much energy in one place. He says stepping away and returning with fresh eyes brings clearer insight into next steps. So sometimes we're told to just focus on one project the whole way through. He says if that's naturally what works for you, go for it. And he says if you need to put a few projects into your workflow, go ahead. In this 3rd phase, crafting, we are bringing ourselves to the project to see what we can offer. In this phase, we begin with a project that has naturally developed, we recognize potential in it, and we see what we can add, take away, or combine to further develop it. He notes that it's not just about building up, it's also about pruning. So remember how in these last phases from our last section, he said, don't prune, let it overgrow, go in all directions, try everything, experiment. Here, there's pruning. He says that part of the goal of developing the work can be accomplished through a pruning process of small cuts. We decide which details and directions might be removed so that more energy and focus can be used to feed the core elements. Remain open to doing whatever it takes to make the art as good as it can be, whether this means inserting yourself more into the details of the process or stepping further away. So again, this beautiful dichotomy we keep seeing with Rick Rubin, showing us that both opposites can be tasted, played with. Where can you add yourself in more? Where can you step further away? And then he also goes on to say that in some projects, you might come to the point where you see that your role in its development has ended there, that you might need someone else. Like maybe you write the lyrics and someone else needs to sing it. Or maybe other projects may be better served if the maestro or designer in this phase conducting the work of others. Physical act of crafting may give them a greater understanding of the art. So all to say, he shows us that ego is not the priority, and that if you need to hand it off like a baton in a marathon, what are those called when you pass off the baton, then that's perfectly fine in the crafting phase. He says crafting can be daunting. It's helpful to still think of it, I said still, but it's helpful to think of it as an opportunity as another opportunity for play. So the play hasn't ended yet. For some artists, crafting is their favorite part of the process. The love and care they put into this phase can be clearly recognized in the final phase of work, the final work. So don't think that just because you're now more focused and because you're more into the nitty-gritty of the project or the process that is boring. It can also be a very, very fulfilling, rewarding part. Next mini chapter is called Momentum. Okay, this one got a couple red stickies. Once enough data is collected and the vision is clear, it can be helpful to set deadlines for completion. So I, as a creative accountability coach, have had so many opinions on deadlines. And he says it's nice to set deadlines, but because our options now in this phase are no longer as unlimited as they were in seeds and experimentation. At the same time, he says a clear finish line. There may not be a clear finish line in sight, but the core elements are there. So he's trying to tell us that it is good to have a deadline, but it's more of a suggested completion date, he says, rather than set in stone. There's still an element of surprise and exploration throughout our execution, and it's possible to find ourselves at any moment back in the experimentation phase. So it's not as linear or chronological as you might expect. And here's another red sticky. He compared, speaking of now setting due dates, or as he calls them, deadlines, he says that for like a business executive or the person who might be funding the project or marketing the project or whoever is in that role, he says that they might think in terms of quarterly earnings, production schedules. I would add profits, I would add competition, I would add pressure from the market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet he says the artist thinks very differently in terms of timeless excellence. So I'm not putting that out there for you to say, okay, yay, that's my free pass to eternally procrastinate. No. And yet I liked the contrast he is sharing here, especially since he's a music producer. I think he's been on different ends of the spectrum of being both an investor and being closer to the music, et cetera. And I think it's really cool that he says that the artist thinks in terms of timeless excellence. So if your project has taken a little longer, for example, my card deck, my flower Spanish card deck, sure, it took a little longer. And yet I remember when I was working on the box design, I was so meticulous to make so many changes. And I like this standard of timeless excellence. While crafting, he says, make deadlines for your own motivation, not necessarily to be shared with others unless it helps with accountability. And that's where I would come in if you need that help. And then he says that as the crafting phase is nearing the end, then we might start thinking of the fixed deadlines. So it's not that we'll never have them, they're just getting more and more defined. Okay, he comes to a point on page 171 where he talks about the pitfalls of staying in the crafting or draft phase for too long, and I can relate to this. He said things like, if you are in a draft for too long and you're reading the same draft for too long, you might accidentally consider that draft what the final is, instead of stepping away from it completely and letting things move in your energy. He doesn't say that, letting things move in your energy, and yet he does earlier talk about the fresh eyes. So I'm paraphrasing, I'm explaining that when you're looking at one draft for way too long, it's almost like, you know, that saying, like a boiled pot, like a watched pot doesn't boil, watch water. So it's like, give it some air to breathe. Don't get so attached to that draft that it then feels so set in stone. He also says the result can be a loss. Okay, another pitfall he says of putting off the momentum, because this whole mini chapter is about momentum, is if you miss the momentum, you could have a loss of connection and enthusiasm for the work over time. I totally agree with this. I agree that things can get cold. And so it's so important to keep in touch with projects you love and notice what rhythm you're working on them and not lose connection to them. Not saying you can't regain that connection, it just might take longer. And here at Create & Company, our goal is not only to create together, it's also to create with more joy, with more ease, with more confidence, with more flow. So I agree with him that momentum is a key ingredient in our creative process. Okay, he also says, he throws in this curveball on page 172, and he says, don't underestimate the power of a work that can be created really quickly. Like he says that there could be a song that you create out of a seed in 5 minutes, and then it's just an initial sketch. It's just a demo, but it actually was the best version. The seed's purest expression, he says. So let's not equate taking longer on a project or having a harder time coming back and forth from it to it being a deeper project or a more meaningful project. He also says that it's possible for great things to be created very quickly. Okay. Then he goes on to say, so it's got a red sticky. This is him talking about something I mentioned a few minutes earlier, where I said that sometimes our attachment to a perfect idea of how our creative project should be can hold us back. And he says, falling short of grander visions might actually put the work exactly where it wants to be. So let's think about that. Thinking you failed to reach this standard might actually put the work here. A phrase that comes to me, yeah, kind of cheesy, but I love it. Remember, have you ever heard like, reach for the stars, you might land on the moon? It's like, what's wrong with reaching higher and then landing pretty high? So he says, do not let the scale of your imagination get in the way of executing a more practical version of your project. We may come to realize that this version is better than the initial, seemingly impossible version. So I hope that reminds you that there's no loss of aiming high and then not reaching exactly that imagination. So he says to make things more practical sometimes. Okay, then he says, okay, I'll end on this point, which I thought was really practical and useful. He says, when you're working on a draft of anything, and I've experienced this with my book, you know how you run into a block at some point and you're like, oh, I don't know how to do this part. I don't know how to express this part, or I don't have the information I need, or I'm just not feeling this part. What do I do? He recommends, instead of just banging your head on the wall on that one part of your project, he says, leave it be and keep filling in the rest. He has so many ideas for this. He says one of the benefits of doing that is that by the time you're done with what you kept going with, you'll have like 89 or 90 or 99% of your draft done. And then that 1%, 2%, 5% that you had to skip throughout the draft won't feel as daunting. You will feel so much more accomplished. And so it will be supportive in you going back and filling in the blanks per se. And I love the metaphor he talks about, like, has anyone made a puzzle, like built a puzzle? You know, when there's this one piece you can't find, if you just let it go and you keep filling in everything else, then it becomes so clear from the remaining few pieces where that one fits. That's how he explains this process works. And I could totally click with that. I hope that that works for you too. He says, oh, check out this metaphor too. He says, all related to this point of not needing to work sequentially or chronologically on your projects and keep just like jumping over hurdles and still building momentum. He says, a bridge is easier to build when it's clear what's on the other side of it. A bridge is easier to build when it's clear what's on the other side of it. So don't let yourselves just stand in the middle of a bridge, which I guess if you haven't built it, that would be impossible in real terms, but you know what I mean. I thought that this was a really cool chapter for someone like me who has let a lot of excuses hold me back from building momentum. I love how he shows us that we only win when we keep going. I loved it. Okay, I'm going to read you the mini poem on the last page of this section, 174, and then we'll wrap up. He says, art is choosing to do something skillfully, caring about the details, bringing all of yourself to make the finest work you can. It is beyond ego, vanity, self-glorification, and need for approval. Putting stuff in perspective. Look at how the colors have evolved. As I run out of one color, I keep going on our rainbow. We are almost halfway on this book together. We're on page 177, and our next mini chapter is called Point of View. I hope you're enjoying going through this book together in this virtual, international, eternal, timeless book club, because that's what it is. You can come back at any time. And I hope you use it as accountability for you to follow along each of these 15-page segments and internalize it, apply it, react to it, ask about it, be in community. So in the comments below, tell me what came up for you today in these 2 mini chapters, which was, let's see if my brain remembers. We had not experimentation, not seeds. We had crafting. And then we had momentum. So what came up for you? Where are you applying these already? What changes will you make in your creative life, in your way of being, in your process? And what is your creative project? If you haven't told me on this series, I would love to know. Comment below. And if you want to even get more personal, you can email me at createandcompany@gmail.com. Let me know if you like this video by liking it. It helps me know this is the kind of stuff you want to hear more about. Subscribe so that we can keep hanging out virtually, eventually in person. And share this with a person who you create with, or you consider creative, or you admire. I would love you to strengthen our Create and Company community. Okay, see you very soon. Bye.